Welcome to the Sandwich Generation Survival Guide. I am your host, Candace Dellacona. On today's episode, we are joined by writer Lisa McCarty. Lisa has written for major publications, including the New York Times, New York Magazine, The Guardian, The Huffington Post, among many others. Lisa explores deeply personal topics with honesty and nuance, from the trials and tribulations of parenthood to women's health. But why Lisa is a guest on the podcast today is because one of the most powerful threads in Lisa's work is caregiving. In fact, in a widely read essay for The Cut, Lisa wrote all about being a caregiver for her mother when she was still very young, which was an experience that shaped her life in ways that she'll share with us. I'm sure she's still unpacking today. We are lucky to have Lisa today join us as a guest. She's currently working on a nonfiction narrative that reflects on that time and what it means to grow and having those responsibilities, many of which most of us don't face until much later in life. So thank you for the courtesy of allowing me that long introduction, Lisa, and welcome to the Sandwich Generation Survival Guide.
Thanks for having me.
So happy to have you.
Thank you.
So we'll just jump right into it. So you've written, as I mentioned, for all of these publications, and most of what you write about is deeply personal. So when did you first realize that your personal experiences, particularly caregiving, were the stories that you wanted to share with the rest of the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's kind of a two-part answer. I'll say, I think I didn't start out wanting to write to share with the world, but I think I really had so many thoughts and feelings about my experience. In particular, it started with grief. The very first essay that I wrote that was publicly posted and published was with Today's Show, and it was actually about being my father's caregiver for many years and then losing him the same week that I welcomed my second child. And I wrote that essay. It started as a really long Google document and then decided that I might want to share it with other people in hopes that they would see themselves in the experience. And so I sent it out and it actually ended up being accepted. And I was like in shock that somebody else wanted to read my story. And when it was published a few weeks later, after a few rounds of edits, working with a wonderful editor there, I was honestly, that day that it came out, I thought, oh my gosh, I think I'm either going to throw up or, like celebrate. I didn't know which to do because it felt really emotionally overwhelming. But that kind of faded into the background because the immediate response that I got from so many people that I knew and also from strangers in comments and DMs and emails and texts and even other parents from school saying I had a really similar experience in caregiving for my parent. I had a really similar experience losing a parent while I also was welcoming my second child or first child. And it was just shocking to me that my writing not only could resonate with a stranger, but also could make me feel really connected to them. And so I think it really helped me to realize that what I once dreamed about in early college, which was to become a writing professor and to write professionally, and I had suppressed that because I thought it wasn't the right path for me based on things I heard from my parents and other people. I realized that that was really what I wanted to do. And so I started writing for other outlets. I started pitching ideas and taking classes to try to figure out how to get my words out there and how to report on stories. And it was really fun. It went from something extremely emotional to something fun.
Yeah.
And then last year when I wrote the piece for The Cut, I decided that I was ready to share that story many years later.
As someone who is also a reader of your work, and that's how we became connected.
Yeah.
It's for those of us out there in the world, when you share the deepest, most personal experiences in life, it shows an incredible vulnerability. And I guess that's part of your job when you become a writer. But certainly I appreciate that, because what you just said was absolutely true, that I think a lot of us are looking for other people that can name it, whatever it is, the it,
Yeah.
whether it's the grief simultaneous with giving birth. I had a similar experience as well. And then your piece in the cut. So, what was the transition for you that made you decide that the piece in the cut about your experience as your mom's caregiver was the right time?
Yeah. As you've read, the piece is about becoming my mother's caregiver when I was only 13. And it was not something that I thought for many years that I would talk about publicly in any way, because it felt like a really private experience. And I also did not realize until I went to therapy in my late 20s, early 30s, that I was even a caregiver. I didn't even know that it actually had a name. And to your point, when we start naming our feelings and emotions and our experiences, we not only can understand ourselves better, but we also can connect with other people who get it. And I think because of the experience of writing in other areas about grief, about caregiving for my dad, and how connected I felt in those times, I also hoped that same connection would happen by sharing that. And so it wasn't like I want to air my dirty laundry to to the world. It was, the intent really was to be vulnerable, as you said, to talk about something that was painful for me, but to turn it into something that I learned from. And I think when it happened, I was only a teenager trying to navigate adolescence and to try to learn how to cope with things, but I didn't have the skills to manage that situation at that time. And I suppressed my emotions for so many years, and I was living in survival mode for so many years that I think last year writing that piece felt like the right time because of where I am in my life and because I am secure in who I am, and I felt ready to not only share the story and to find that positive connection, but also to bear the brunt of what you do as a public figure when you're writing about these things and you're sharing your story, just like we're talking now. And I was ready for that feedback. I wasn't looking for it, but I certainly was ready to manage it because I knew that I had the coping skills to do that as an adult in my 40s who's gone through many years of therapy. And I think the ending to that piece, not to spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it, but finding healing in myself and finding ways to forgive ourselves for things that we could not have known better at a young age, and to be accepting of ourselves and our experiences. Because I think once we get to that point, it's taken a long time, certainly for me to get there. But I think as women, especially, if we can be more accepting of ourselves and we can learn from experiences and share them with each other, I think as caregivers, as women, it offers an opportunity to learn from each other and to lift each other up and to not feel so alone.
And that's really one of the reasons why you write what you write. And we have the podcast, and I think others really find that these messages resonate, the sense of community. But what I think is so unique about your experience as a caregiver is your age.
Yeah.
And we, as fully baked humans, have access to things like therapy and being able to talk to each other and looking for resources.
Yeah.
But you, having gone through this beginning at age 13, was so transformative in so many ways. So, how do you think being a young caregiver shaped you now? Do you think that you were better able to throw your hands up and say, I can't do it all? How do you think that has really impacted you in your maybe role as a mom now, or your place in your community or in your own family structure now?
Yeah. It's a great question and it's a complicated answer. I would say, as caregivers in adulthood, it's a lot easier to speak up, to say, hey, this isn't working for me, when we are, as you said, fully baked humans and we have the coping skills. But as as a child, essentially in that situation, my brain wasn't developed, enough at that stage. And although my mom was very supportive and loving and wonderful prior to the accident, she came home a different person. She was incapacitated and unable to give me the emotional, psychological support that I needed at a very critical time in my life. And it's not any fault of her own. It was the accident, of course.
Yeah.
But I do think it was especially challenging to learn from that because, as I said, I wasn't dealing with a lot of those emotions for many, many years. It impacted my identity, impacted my self-worth, my ability to build healthy romantic relationships, healthy friendships. I felt very dependent on other people when I was outside of the caregiving situation because I just wanted to be loved and accepted.
Yeah.
But all that to say, I think it prepared me to caregive for my dad as an adult because I was able to build those skills. I think there were positive and negatives to it. When I was caregiving for my dad, I certainly had a significant amount of empathy for what he was going through. He lived in heart failure for many years, but he also was diagnosed in the last few years of his life with colon cancer. So that was ultimately, unfortunately, what took him. But he lived in many years in bad health. And so I was his everything for that time. And I think I adapted those skills that I learned as a child with empathy, with patience, the things that I wish I could have done a lot better as a kid. I did the best I could with what I had. But then on a negative, I would also say I struggled to set boundaries early on with him when I was
Mm.
caregiving for him because I had become a people pleaser. I had become the person that just wanted everything to be okay. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, that is, I think, very common for many caregivers, both in adulthood and in childhood. We often want to just caregive and love them and to give them what they need because we hope that we can just make everything better. But the reality is that we're also navigating, managing a personality. It's not just caregiving the actual task, it's caregiving plus the relationship, which makes it extremely challenging.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you phrased it that way too, because it's like you had the opportunity almost as a do-over as an adult to be the caregiver,
Yeah.
and perhaps in ways that you, looking back, couldn't have been when you were a child as a caregiver for your mom. So you were in many ways better prepared, but the die had been cast in some ways. And because of that, boundaries were more difficult. And we hear that all the time with caregivers, that boundaries is, it's probably the hardest topic for many of us
Yeah.
to tackle and implement,
Yeah.
even as an adult. But when you look back to your role as your mom's caregiver, when you were in it, did you realize that you were a caregiver at that age? Or was it something that you realized only looking back as an adult?
No, I think I did not realize that I was a caregiver at the time. I think the way that I looked at it from the moment that the accident happened, she left that morning, the independent single mother that was in charge of everything, taking me to and from dance and gymnastics, buying groceries, paying the bills. As someone who grew up in a single family household, I think it was a shock when it first happened. And so
Yeah.
I thought that when that accident happened, she came home that afternoon, the house was dark, walked upstairs, and she was laying in bed and not talking. And I thought, this isn't normal. And every part of my body was like terrified that either she was going to die and I was going to be left alone, or that I wouldn't have any idea what I was doing. And so I think that the idea of being a caregiver never crossed my mind. I think it was more like I have to do everything I can to take care of her the way she took care of me because that's all I know what to do right now. There was no one to give me guidance. She was the one that gave me guidance when I did
Yeah.
my homework.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like doing math problems together at the dining table. And then all of a sudden I was the one in charge. It was
Yeah.
definitely a shock to the system. I didn't view it as caregiving until I went to therapy and realized how difficult and how traumatic that experience was for me.
And I think it's important for the listeners to understand too that it wasn't entirely clear in the beginning that your
Yeah.
mom was so injured.
Yes.
And so there was less of a sort of blueprint about what the next day would even look like.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how you dealt with the uncertainty of what that looked like, and then how you came to grasp the gravity of her limitations?
Yeah, sure. So I think how I dealt with uncertainty was just by doing, because the only thing I think I knew how to do at that moment when came home and found her, and they initially told us that it was a concussion. The doctors told her when she went to the hospital earlier that day, and then I guess she was taken home, and then it was my responsibility. There,
Which is crazy when you think about it now,
right,
Lisa, right?
exactly. I
Like,
have a daughter who is 13, the
right,
exact age that I was when
right.
it happened, and I often now think that the timing of my sharing my story, and also the timing of sort of this realization that significant role reversal, but also change in responsibility. It's one thing to have your kid do the dishes, like she empties the dishwasher and she's very
Yeah.
helpful and independent, but to have her learn to pay the bills and to do the meals and to all of a sudden be taking care of me instead of herself while also going to school, I can't imagine that.
And it's a systemic failure from the jump, right?
Yes.
Because here this woman comes in with an injury and she's told that it's a concussion,
Yes.
that's something that a lot of us have sustained, and life goes on
Yeah.
and you don't have any long-term effects. So they release her. So there's the fact that as a woman and the healthcare that we receive,
Yeah.
she's released on her own accord without any sort of infrastructure to help her.
Yes.
And then her daughter is expected to step in. Like, where were the professionals? I'm sure you shake your fist at the universe at, like,
Yes.
how could that have been put upon
Yes.
her? Because she also had a brain injury.
Right.
So
They
she
didn't know
also
that
couldn't
until years
advocate.
later. Right.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it was a systemic failure twofold, not only for me, because there was
Yeah.
no infrastructure, no system in place. That
Right.
the medical system failed because they didn't say who's taking care of her at home. They just assumed there was a dad living in the house and my parents divorced when I was very young. So there wasn't. There was no
Right.
one else. There was no one else living in the house. It was my mom and I. There was no educational system that was aware that I was caregiving. No one noticed at school. No teachers noticed. There was
Yeah.
no non-official systems. There was no nonprofit stepping in. There was no community. There's no village. There was no extended
Yeah.
family available, nothing. And
Right.
then there was also the second part of the failure was the failure to my mom, because not only did they not do their due diligence. Certainly, they did the process of what an ER visit is, probably like 18 minutes with the doctor or whatever it is now.
Yeah.
And they determined that she was capable of going home, I guess. I don't know. I wasn't there, I was at school. But they did assume she would be fine in a few weeks. And weeks went by, and I was basically taking care of her in the morning, going to school, coming home and taking care of her again. And that continued on for weeks into months, and then became 2 years. And we saw several doctors during that time, and no doctor, neurologists could figure it out. And many of them thought she was making it up. So unfortunately, we look at our current medical system and the way that things are structured. And as a woman who has personally been misdiagnosed and overlooked and gaslit, I would also say that's still an issue. And many years later, we did find she became more independent. And 2 years in, I started to resist and rebel against that role. And I started hanging out with kids that were older than me, and
Yeah.
also drinking and abusing drugs and acting out because I was so unhappy with the way that my life had shaped into something that was no longer I was no longer independent, I was no longer free. It all was about caring for her. And
Yeah.
obviously, again, not her fault, but I was very resentful of the situation. So I would just say that the systemic failures that happened to me, unfortunately, are still happening to kids like me. And just for situational awareness for listeners, there are close to 7 million children and adolescents. According to a study in 2020 by AARP, it was actually 5.4 million. But the president of American Association of Caregiving, Connie Siskowitz, actually gave an interview about a year ago, and she said, I actually think it's close to 7 million. So I would agree with her because I know that I've seen so much data around in the UK and in the US about children being negatively impacted by this. And it's something that affects people into adulthood. And it definitely did for me. I mean, in hindsight, I see the caregiving experience for my mom as both positive and negative. I think
Sure.
certainly I am where I am. I'm still here because of
Yeah.
therapy. If I hadn't gone
Yeah.
to therapy, I'm not sure that I would have been able to live a healthy, happy, mentally stable life, if you will. I think I struggled for many years with anxiety and depression and isolation and all of these things that are unfortunately very common from kids like me. But I was able to adapt and learn coping skills that allowed me to be a better caregiver to my dad. And also, as we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, to set boundaries more
Mm.
effectively. And as a mom now, for the last decade or a little more, I am doing a better job as a caregiver in that aspect of knowing when I need space and knowing when I need to put myself first. Because as moms, we don't do a good job of that at all.
We don't.
Well, I
We don't.
certainly don't. I won't speak for all moms, but I know that
Yeah.
it's hard. It's hard to balance. And caregiving as well can often lead to burnout. And I think we don't talk about that enough.
Yeah, I think too, you bring a perspective that is not often talked about being a young caregiver. Because if you look at the statistics, I think that about 34% of kids are growing up in a single parent household.
Yeah.
And life happens all the time. So I have a feeling the number of young caregivers is much higher than we would think. You were one of the silent young caregivers because you didn't know who to tell and
Yeah.
nobody thought to ask.
Right.
So when you think about young people who are in your position now, do you think, especially for podcasts like mine and the resources, that the young caregivers are being overlooked?
Yeah.
And what would you say to them? What would be your advice going back and something that would have served you well, maybe as a young caregiver?
Yeah. I would say to anyone that's caregiving that is not yet an adult to know that number one, you're not alone in your experience,
Mm.
because at the time when I was going through it, I certainly thought that I was the only one. And I thought that I wasn't allowed to talk about my experience because no one else was talking about it. So why would I bring
Yeah.
it up? And I also felt as though I was a burden in the situation because my mom's care was the priority.
Interesting.
Yeah, I felt guilty when I left the house and I wasn't with her, but I also
Oh,
felt guilty even bringing up anything that was on my mind, not only to her because she was barely functioning, to
yeah.
much less to a teacher or anyone else. So I would say to someone who is struggling and you're a young caregiver or a caregiving youth, as they're referred to in the US, I would say it's really important to talk about your feelings. If you feel like you can't safely talk to someone in your family about it, then find a friend that you trust or talk to a teacher that you feel safe talking to or a counselor, because there's always someone that is willing to listen. And I think at the time, as I said, I didn't think that my feelings mattered, that
Yeah.
I was less of a priority. And I think that really weighed on me for decades until I came to terms with the fact that I actually had a traumatic experience and that it really significantly impacted my life. And if I had talked about it sooner and there was support, mental health support, especially, and also respite care, someone coming in and helping with her, if I had talked about it, maybe we would have had help, or maybe there would have been someone at least to listen, to hear how I was feeling so I wouldn't feel so alone.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think talking about it in whatever outlet, in whatever way, whatever platform you
Yeah.
could can possibly bring some relief and some help. And I think too, when you are a kid,
Yeah.
you don't have any orientation of
Yeah.
what the universe is. And so feeling afraid to bring it up, probably because you didn't want to get your mom in trouble, or
Yeah.
you didn't want to be in trouble,
Yeah.
or have anyone think that you're complaining about the situation because your
Right.
sympathy lied with your mom.
Yeah.
So all of those things make so much sense when you think about it from the kid's perspective. But
Yeah.
now that you're at this place, and I hope I can announce that you're writing a book about your experience,
Yes.
which is remarkable.
As mothers, as caregivers, really in any capacity of work, we have to learn to, and I do feel like this whole idea of finding a balance is frankly BS, because I don't know that there is one. I think you just have to know your limits. I think that's really where it becomes like prioritizing your mental health, figuring out how to find not a balance, but really find limits and set boundaries more firmly in your life, and to figure out what that looks like for you. And it looks
Yeah.
different for everyone. You
Like,
might be working on 3 books or 3 major projects for work while also raising kids and, doing something, a major project for someone. And I think for me, I know that writing this book while also parenting and managing a husband who travels every other week, it is hard because it's some form of PTSD, according to my therapist.
how has it been trying to endeavor this writing process that's
Yeah.
honest and from your perspective, and like looking back on what other people's behaviors and their actions were? Did you ever get to a point where you thought, I don't know if I can share this about my mom or about
Yeah.
what happened?
Yes. Yes, definitely. I think as a writer and also as a caregiver, we often want to protect the people we're caring for. And
Yeah.
also as a daughter, I certainly want to protect her privacy and
Yeah.
also respect where the boundaries are in her situation, because it was a traumatic experience for her as much as it was for me. And I think that, I mean, 33 years later, or actually 34 this year, she's still living with a brain injury. She's living independently. She lives far away, but she is functioning on her own now, which is feels like a win for me. Like
Yeah.
I was able to support her the way that she needed when she needed, and I think that feels really rewarding. That's the part of
Yeah.
caregiving that's rewarding. But I would say, with respect to the book, it's a balance of emotional honesty and being completely vulnerable of my experience firsthand, but also finding where those limitations are in comfortability, not only with my experience and sharing like certain details I might be less comfortable sharing if there's something that I know that she's not comfortable with. So I think it's emotionally honest as humanly possible because it's reported nonfiction and there's a narrative in there. And I don't want to feel as though I'm not being honest with the reader, of course. But at the same time, I think, and I'm certainly going to say this in the book as well, that it's portrayed as honestly as I can, but there may be certain details left out out of respect for privacy for my mom.
Yeah, which makes sense, and trying to strike the balance, as you point out, because the whole point in writing the subjects that you choose to tackle is the authenticity. I think that's
Yeah.
why your work resonates with so many people, because it's authentic
Thank you.
and because we see ourselves in those authentic experiences. So if you viewed everything through rose-colored glasses, I think you'd alienate the audience that probably share the common experience.
Yeah.
While at the same time being respectful to your mom and what her experience is. So
Yeah.
I'm really excited to read the book. I know that you've probably struck the right balance between the two, but what I'll ask you maybe is for those people who are listening now, we talk a lot about surviving the sandwich generation, and your role is what we define the sandwich generation started at a much sort of younger age, and you've been in it for such a long time.
Yeah.
So how do you maybe, or maybe what is your best advice to those listening about what thriving means to you, not
Sure.
just surviving?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I think just like we set our own limitations and we define our own ability of what we can do, what is feasible and what works for us, I think we also need to define our own or create our own definition of what thriving looks like for ourselves. For
Yeah.
me, thriving looks like taking time for myself when I can and scheduling it on my calendar. So, like, I know when it's feasible and when it's not, certain times of the day. And I also think, from a writing perspective and with respect to this book, it's been working on it for 4 or 5 hours and then taking a break for a couple of hours or even a couple of days if I feel like I'm forcing it.
Mm.
And I think if someone wants to either verbally or through writing or through your podcast, which I love so much, to share their story, I think finding that genuine comfortability, like wherever that is, if it is sharing it out loud with someone else, a friend, or publicly, do what feels right for you and don't feel forced to talk about it. And with respect to thriving in general, I think for me, I think it means like my kids at the end of the day feel loved and held and safe. And I do think that's also giving myself some of that love too, because I think I've been hard on myself for many years, and to give myself some grace in some moments, that's probably what thriving mostly looks like. And it's also honoring our experiences and the things that we've gone through because they don't always look pretty. And as you said, if you were to write or share in ways that aren't completely clear and transparent, if it doesn't look messy, then someone's probably not being completely honest about their experience. And I think in caregiving, especially, it is messy. It's not a perfect balance. It doesn't look like a beautiful life all the time. While I do believe, and I know many writers and authors have written about the idea that caregiving can be transformational and transformative in an experience, for me, I would say it's been both. It's been messy and difficult and traumatic at some points, but also it has been something that has changed my life. And so I'm choosing to learn from it and turn pain into purpose, if you will.
I love it. That is a great way to end this episode, Lisa. Thank you so much for spending so much time with us. We're all looking forward to your book. And when it is released, we will make sure to have you come back on and share all of the information on where our listeners can get it. Really, thank you for always being so open and transparent. I know that you have helped people already, and I'm sure you'll help even more with our podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Don't forget to subscribe to the Sandwich Generation Survival Guide. A new episode drops each month. And if you're enjoying it, please don't forget to leave me a 5-star review and share with your fellow Sandwich Generation members. For a complete listing of past podcast episodes, you can check out any podcast platform, or you can head to my website at www.sandwichgenerationlaw.com. Thanks for listening.